Welcome to the Child Anxiety FAQ podcast. FAQ stands for Frequently Asked Questions, and I'll be answering your questions about child and teen anxiety. My name is Dawn Friedman, and I have been working with kids and families for over 30 years as a preschool teacher, parent educator, family case manager, clinical counselor, and now as the facilitator of Child Anxiety Support, a program for parents of anxious kids. All right, let's get started. Hey, everybody. This week's question is one that has come up periodically during the time that I have been doing the podcast, and that is, how do I talk to my anxious child about death? And usually when the parents come to me about this, it's because there has already been some anxiety about death. The child is already worried about getting ill or someone else getting sick or getting hurt. And so the parent is struggling. How do I talk to them about death, especially if there has been a death in the family, without scaring the child further? And I also have heard from people that for many kids, this anxiety has increased during COVID, that this was something that came up earlier for kids when we were masking, when kids were staying home from school. And many of the kids then got a kind of outsized fear of dying themselves or somebody that they loved dying, or those children did lose someone and now are afraid of losing someone else. There are a couple of things here, and one is, how do you talk to a child about death? And that, of course, is going to be very personal and depend on your family's values around death and dying and illness and the afterlife and all those other very complicated things. You need to get comfortable with whatever language your family uses. And I know you have heard before that we don't tell children they went to sleep and didn't wake up, because that's really scary for a child who may already have some bedtime separation worries. We do not use that language. We do need to become comfortable using words like death and dying. Now, beyond that, some of the language like pass over, passed away, those are going to be cultural, and you will need to figure out what is the language that your family uses, so you can say, in our family, when we say passed away, we mean died. We also need to think about the kinds of questions kids are going to ask, like what happens to you after you die? And again, we need to find language that we're comfortable with. Now, I think death, like lots of topics, are going to be a matter of us getting comfortable with how we want to communicate our values to our child. That includes discussions about sex and drinking and drugs and death. These are big, uncomfortable conversations. We need to figure out, what do we want our child to know about it? What do we think is important for them so they can grow up to be people who can manage these kinds of topics themselves? When it comes to death, that means, what are your family's beliefs about an afterlife? How does your family handle death? What are your family's rituals? What is a funeral like? Do people in your family get cremated, or are they buried? Do you have an open casket funeral? Do you do anything on the anniversary of someone's death? Think about those things. It can help support you in how you talk to your child. Now, the other thing is, I think one of the best resources you have is your friendly neighborhood librarian. Seriously, I would go to the library, I encourage you to do this, and say to the librarian, point me to the books about death for a child this age, or point me to the good books you have to talk about death and dying and other hard topics with kids. Books are your friends here. They can help you figure it out. Picture books can help share your values with your child. Now, for me, I love everything Mr. Rogers does. I think Mr. Rogers has a great book about death, but your mileage may vary. You may have somebody else whose language around death is more helpful to you. But again, we need to be clear about death and dying and not sort of gloss over those hard things. So that's talking about death. Now we're talking specifically about anxious kids. And remember, at the core of anxiety is avoidance. So think about your avoidance. Are you avoiding talking about death? Are you worried about how it's going to impact your child? That avoidance needs care, not more avoidance. By the same token, your anxious child needs to know about death too. That means not hiding death from them, not avoiding the discussion because it will upset them. It will upset them. It's upsetting. Death can be very upsetting. And instead of thinking, how can I make sure that this discussion doesn't upset my child? We can think about, how can I help my child deal with the discomfort of learning about death? Now, there's a whole nother thing too, which is then you have the kids that become obsessed with worry about death. And then we're talking about coping with the discomfort and learning how not to get stuck in reassurance with our child. And that is a whole nother ballgame. Way too big for this podcast. But again, anxiety is about avoidance. How can we go towards with support? If there's a specific challenge you have, if you are dealing with a death in the family, if you are dealing with illness in the family, I highly encourage you to think about working with a child life specialist. Now, child life specialists are trained to talk to kids about hard topics around health, around illness, around death, and around dying. They are a tremendously wonderful resource. And what's really great is now in the age of virtual support, you don't need to have someone in your local community because many of them are working online. And how do you find a child life specialist? Google is your friend. Reaching out to your local children's hospital or nearest children's hospital and getting some names. They have child life specialists who work in the hospital, but they may have some ideas of people who also work in private practice. Some of them will come to your home if you're local. Others will work with you on Zoom or work with your child on Zoom, and they can help you navigate difficult discussions like, why is grandma ill? Maybe a parent who is dealing with a cancer diagnosis, maybe a child who is afraid of certain medical challenges that they're facing and needs to talk about their fear. And this is different than counseling, which is more about processing these fears. A child life specialist is very practical and gives good education and support and language for families who are dealing with these kinds of struggles. Thanks for tuning in this week. If you have a question you'd like me to address on the show, please go to childanxietysupport.com/question and you can post it there. Maybe I'll address it on a future episode. And if you'd like to learn more about my program, you can visit childanxietysupport.com. Thanks so much and have a great week.